Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Juskewycz of DailyFantasyWinners, and it's another episode of Tee to Green. And for this episode is the preview of the RBC Canadian Open. This is a tournament that this year is actually sandwiched between the Open Championship and the PGA Championship. And, of course, we all know the PGA Championship is usually more in the middle of August, but, of course, with the Olympics going on, the PGA Championship is next week. And so don't think that really means anything as far as for anything that would really change strategically this week. The only thing that might change a touch is if there is some bad weather that comes in this week, or someone's battling a tiny bit of an injury and they're on the fence about, maybe should I pull out, should I rest the injury, there might be a little bit more willing to withdraw if they are participating in the PGA Championship next week if something like that does come up. But for the most part, that's just pretty much out of your control, obviously, anyway. So it is a little bit maybe more of a risky tournament and a little bit more variance in that regard. But nevertheless, everything else should be the same. The winning score of this golf tournament is usually well under par, usually in the upper teens. 17, 18 under par is where it's kind of been the last couple of years. Glen Abbey is a very scoreable course, and that is where the tournament is this year. It's in Oakville, Ontario, which is just a little bit southwest of Toronto and actually northwest of Buffalo, pretty close to the U.S.-Canada border. And basically, it's on the west side of Lake Ontario to get an idea of exactly where it's at. It's not right on Lake Ontario, but it's pretty close to the water, essentially. Glen Abbey does not always host the RBC Canadian Open. It was there last year in 2015. It was there in 2013, and then you have to go back to 2009 for the time it was at Glen Abbey before that. So it's been used frequently, but just not all the time. So if you're going to do a little bit of course history, go take a look at. I would just take a look at 2015 and 2013. Really, you can go back to 09, 08 if you want to, but obviously the farther back you go, the less accurate it will be on a couple different accounts. Details of Glen Abbey Golf Course. It is a par 72 that tips out at 7,253 yards. It's not a very long course for a par 72. As far as maybe some other details, there are narrowish fairways here, but at the same time, the rough is not really that penalizing here. Essentially, if you look at past results here, driving accuracy has not been that important. However, if you do miss the fairway really badly and you really spray one, there are times where you can get into major trouble because you can hit it. There are several places where the woods do come into play, but you really, again, like I said, you have to spray one pretty badly. So again, statistically, driving accuracy isn't that big of a deal, but you just hope you dodge the bullet of somebody blasting 130 yards offline, I guess, or maybe not that bad, but something like that. And there is also a decent amount of water on this golf course, so there will be a little bit of variance that kicks in there. As far as sometimes you might be you think you hit a good shot and it ends up in the water hazard, so that will happen occasionally there, which shuffles up the leaderboard a little bit more with some variance there. But nevertheless, it's usually a tournament where it is a tee to green type of golf course, and longer hitters generally do a little bit better here just because they're usually not quite as accurate, and driving accuracy isn't that big of a deal. More on that in just a second, because we're going to talk about the 4 par 5s on the golf course. They are all reachable in 2, and they are all reachable by most people. The distances and how many eagles have been recorded there each of the last couple of years. Number 2 is at 527 yards. There were 20 eagles in 2015 and 15 eagles in 2013. Number 13, probably the toughest of the 4 par 5s, is at 558 yards. The second shot is over water, and there's water actually down the whole left-hand side of the hole. For most of it, actually, as well. And there were 5 eagles there last year, and then 8 eagles in 2013. Hole 16 at 516 yards. There was 17 eagles in 15, 11 and 13. And then on hole 18 is 524 yards. 33 eagles actually on that hole last year, and then 20 in 2013, and that's actually kind of a pretty cool finishing hole on a par 5s for DFS purposes, but also just as golf fans, because there is water right in front of the green on the second shot, and pretty much everybody goes for it as long as their tee shot is reasonable and in the fairway. So usually some exciting dramatic finishes. So again, pretty much everybody of all distances will be able to go for this green in 2, and even number 13 I think on PGAtour.com they say usually only the longer hitters go 4 and 2, but if you take a look at the shot tracker last year, you'll see guys like Jim Furyk and some of the other shorter hitters who did go for number 13 and 2. As long as you're in the fairway or even catch a good lie in the rough on 13, we see shorter hitters go 4 and 2. So longer hitters aren't exactly, they're not required to get those eagles, which are going to be important here for this tournament. But at the same time, the driving accuracy won't really be penalizing you that much, so longer hitters are of course good too as well. Basically saying you have some flexibility there on how you want to make your lineups. So let's move on here to the statistics. Let's see, strokes gained off the tee. Strokes gained approaching the green will actually be more important than strokes gained off the tee. Approaching the green is definitely a good thing for this course. Now, we definitely want to look at birdie or better percentage because there will be a lot of birdies and eagles out there, and that's where we obviously get a lot of the scoring with 3 birdies or 3 points for birdies and 8 points for eagles, and there are a lot of eagles out there. So because of that, we're also going to definitely take a look at going for the green. There are 3 different going for the green statistics we want to look at. Going for the green hit percentage, going for the green birdie or better percentage, and average distance after going for it, going for the green in 2, or 2 on a par 5, 1 on a par 4, essentially. And the reason why we want to take a look at all 3 is because they all tell a piece to the puzzle, essentially. If you do just look at going for the green hit percentage, yeah, that's good. If you hit the ball on the green, you have an eagle putt. But at the same time, if maybe you've been hitting the green quite a bit, but you end up 30, 40 feet away from the hole a lot of the time. So maybe you want to take a look at going for the green birdie or better percentage. But which is obviously really good because you're making the good scores, but maybe you're just scrambling really well and you're not necessarily giving yourself realistic eagle putts or opportunities. So then maybe you want to look at average distance after going for in the shot, which tells you, just your average distance away from the hole after your second shot on a par 5 or your tee shot on a par 4, but it's most often your second shot on a par 5. But there is a catch to that, is because the ball can be on the green, it can be around the green, or it can even be in the water, and they will, give an approximate guess there about how far you are away from the hole when your ball actually lands in the water. So there's actually kind of each piece kind of fits into the puzzle a little bit. So when you're doing your research and trying to make your picks, go take a look at all 3 of those lists and kind of see where they end up on each of those 3 lists, because that is going to be an important factor. And we're kind of late enough into the year. We're in late July now. Most of the season is over. We've only got 2 months left in the season, essentially. So the sample size is almost pretty much about as good as it's going to get when it comes to some of these statistics. And you usually get a good feel for kind of how players have done this year in situations like this. And the last thing I'll also add on to this going for the green thing as well, if you want a bigger sample size, which is definitely a good thing, you can take a look also at approaches to the green from over 200 yards, just generally speaking. Or you can maybe want to take a look at just in the fairway, but I would take a look at the rough as well, quite frankly, because this rough isn't that penalizing. But pretty much almost all, except for maybe a few of the bombers on a couple of the holes, for the most part, every shot of players going for the green in 2 is going to be between 200 and 250 yards. So you can get a bigger sample size if you just look at that, because obviously, whether you're hitting a second shot on a par 5, or it's a long shot on a par 3, or it's a long par 4, you're obviously, for the most part, your goal is to get the ball in a hole, and you're doing the fewest strokes possible. You really don't play. That's not necessarily a different approach to when you're going for the green in 2 on a par 5 versus the second shot on a long par 4. Par is just a number. Essentially, it's not a number. Doesn't really change the strategy too much from the way the players approach the golf hole. It changes the way the scoring works on DraftKings, of course, but it doesn't really change the approach to the players on the golf hole necessarily. So, and just to give you a taste of why driving accuracy, this is the last thing before we'll get into the picks, why driving accuracy hasn't been important here in years past. This is just kind of a sample of last year. If you take a look at the top 5 on the leaderboard last year, Jason Day, who won the tournament last year, 38.1% of the fairways. That's how much percent he hit the fairways. It was pretty darn low. Keep on going down the list. Bubba Watson only had 45.2% of his fairways. David Hearn at 50%. Jim Furyk was at 59.5%. That was, the one person who did hit more fairways, or a very high percentage of his fairways. I think it was like top 10, top 15 in the field that week at that number. Stuart Sink, who's usually a pretty high fairway guy, he only hit 52.4% of his fairways, which is pretty average. And then Tom Hoagie only hit 31% of his fairways, and he was tied for fifth along with Stuart Sink. So anyways, that just gives you kind of an idea. The driving accuracy really isn't that big of a deal here. Okay, let's move on to the picks, and a couple things before we get into the specific picks on the A list. Is recent performance a good thing? Absolutely it is. However, I wouldn't pay much attention to the Open Championship results. How you scored at the Open Championship very much depended on when you teed off each day. How you had the late Thursday, early Friday tee time certainly had a big advantage on the field. And plus, not only that, the guys who teed off later in the day on Sunday actually had a pretty big advantage. That kind of went unnoticed a little bit just because, it was basically a battle between Phil and Henrik, which was awesome to watch. But we kind of went unnoticed because the golf tournament had pretty much come down to those two guys going into Sunday, and we clearly got that picture just a few holes in on Sunday as well. So it's a good thing to know that just because somebody shot maybe a couple strokes better than somebody on the leaderboard and finished 20 or 30 places higher, that doesn't necessarily mean they played better. That person played better golf than the other person. I just really wouldn't look at the Open Championship results that much if when it comes to making your picks, unless if it somehow comes into play as how you think someone's ownership might be. Then for your GPP strategy, it could tweak it a little bit. But as far as how well you think someone's going to perform at the RBC Canadian Open, I just would not look at the Open Championship as a good indicator for that. So secondly, if you look at the odds per dollar tab, the Canadians, because it is the RBC Canadian Open, have really good odds for the price on DraftKings. That's just generally speaking for most of the players. Don't fall for that is my advice. And there is going to be some DFS buzz that Canadians do play better here. Yeah, if you look at each of the last 2 years, there have been two Canadians that have finished inside the top 10, both in 2015 and 2014. However, if you go look at a couple years further back and look at 2013 and 2012, the top Canadian in 2013 finished tied for 44th, and the top Canadian in 2012 was tied for 56th. So I don't think it's really that big of a boost, and I think you're basically walking into a trap a little bit because the ownership of the better Canadian players are going to be pretty highly owned in my estimation. So. And because I don't think there is really a Canadian golfer that's playing spectacularly well this year as of late, I would just recommend kind of fading at least the top Canadian players, like Graham Dillette, Adam Hadwin, David Hearn, like those few guys. I would recommend, or at least limiting your exposure of them. If not, I would just go ahead and fade them pending how many lineups you are making. So on to the picks, though. This is what you all probably came here for the most. But let's take a look here. There are the top two guys here in Dustin Johnson and Jason Day in the 12,000 range. So their ownership is going to be very high. I'm expecting Dustin Johnson's ownership to be at least 35%, and I honestly think it'll probably be more like 40%. And then Jason Day, probably not as much, will probably be more in that 30% range, so to speak. But they're going to, I think, between the two of them, eat up about 70% of the possible 600% of ownership, essentially, and which is a lot, to say the least. And so if you're going to make only a couple lineups, my recommendation is just to fade them and not use them. But if you're making a bunch of lineups and a bunch of GPP lineups, then I think fading them is crazy, and you don't want to do that. I would say hedge a little bit, just because obviously Jason and Dustin either of them could win this tournament. But if you're only going to make a couple of them, I think your better edge is just simply putting some more exposure into some of the cheaper guys and making your top salary pick in the $10,000 or $9,000 range, or maybe even the $8,000 range if you really want to go balanced salary method. But that would be my recommendation, though. And just for why I think Dustin will be owned more than Jason, we got a pretty good glimpse of that last week at the Open Championship. Dustin Johnson was owned, I believe it was about 30% in the Millionaire Maker, while Jason Day was just at 17%. That was shocking to me that Jason was only 17%. I think that caught a lot of people off guard. So there probably will be a little bit of a correction there, and that gap will narrow a little bit. But I still think Dustin will be owned more than Jason, just based on recent performance, and he's kind of the flavor of the last few weeks, or the flavor of the month, if you will, going back to the U.S. Open. So in any case, that would be my advice for the top two players. And then also take a look at Matt Kuchar. I think his ownership will be very high as well, and most people will like him a lot just in comparison to the other golfers that are priced just below him. The recent performance will essentially prevail on this one. And he had like 26% ownership last week. Now, obviously, it was like 7,800, and that's much different than paying, over $10,000 for him. But nevertheless, Kuchar, I would think in most people's minds, is clearly the third best golfer right now in this field. And so I think you're going to see close to, I don't know if it'll be high as 26%, but I do think it's going to be well over 20% for Kuchar. And I would just basically use the same approach for Kuchar as I would toward Jason Day and Dustin Johnson, simply just that I would limit your exposure if you're going to make a bunch of GPP lineups, or I would fade him if you're only going to make like, 2 or 3, so to speak. And if you're looking for me to just pick somebody between Dustin Johnson and Jason Day, I'm still going to pick Jason Day right now. Jason was really in one of the bad draws from last week. He obviously didn't play well on Thursday at the Open Championship, but nevertheless, I do think he was really in the bad draw on Friday and then played earlier in the day on Sunday. So, but I still think he's the best player. And basically, Jason and Dustin honestly have very similar statistics in almost every area, except Jason's just better. Jason's short game is better than Dustin's. Mainly speaking, long-term wise. And so Dustin's wedge game is massively improved. And I think, Jason's and Dustin's wedge game are about equal, and Dustin maybe even have a tiny bit of an edge there. But the short game, Jason's is better. And so that's why I will definitely prefer Jason over Dustin right now. And especially since the Dustin's going to be owned more. So that's my recommendation there. That wraps up those top 3 guys. So we'll move on to more. Now, my A-list players. Okay, so Jim Furyk is the first one at 9,900. I think he's got good value considering who is priced around him. And most may think Furyk is still shaking off the rust, from the injury, or his swing is off, considering that, injury people usually think that it applies to the long game being off. But really, he's been hitting the ball pretty darn well over his last few tournaments. And it's really the short game that's kind of let him down. But again, the short game for Jim Furyk is really what has historically been very strong for him, even as just as recently as last year. So essentially, I think we're going to see some positive regression for Jim Furyk as far as his short game is concerned. And I expect the tee to green game to still be strong. And I would be shocked if he wasn't in contention on Sunday. Let's take a look at a couple $8,000 level golfers. Jon Rahm at 8,600 and Emiliano Grillo at 8,500. For Rahm, he's obviously gotten a good amount of publicity. A lot of people like the new prospect, or they like the new toy, essentially. But Rahm is one of the bright young stars. Certainly, I think rising stars. Will be one of the rising stars on tour. He got 10% ownership in the Millionaire Maker last week at 6,700, I think it was, is the upper 6,000 range. But given his average performance and his particularly big bump in his price, I just don't think his ownership will be that high. And I legitimately think he can win this golf tournament, and his talent really is that legit. So I think, if Jon Rahm's ownership percentage is, even just at like 10-12%, something like that, which is what I think it will be, I think that's perfectly fine for using him. At 8,600, he might even be a little bit less than that, just because that's such a big price jump, and he didn't really have the greatest Open Championship performance. So I think you're going to get a good pick there. And then Grillo at 8,500. Awesome tee to green game. Very solid in going for the green stats. He's in really good recent form. Again, I don't think the ownership actually for the $8,000 level guys, generally speaking, will be too bad this week. So I think Grillo, he will be probably one of the more higher owned $8,000 level golfers, but I don't think it's going to be that bad because so many people are going to be committing to Dustin, Jason, and Kuchar, and there are going to be enough players in the $8,000 range that'll spread out the ownership enough. I just don't think one particular person in the $8,000 range will pop as far as the ownership percentage goes. So those are my top 2 guys for the $8,000 level on the A-list. We'll take a look at 3 $7,000 level golfers. Harold Varner III, very good recent form. awesome going for the green stats, one of the best on tour, actually. And outside of some mediocre putting, his game really has been fantastic from top to bottom all year. Think you're getting some solid value there at 7,800, really, for Harold. At 7,700, Jimmy Walker. And I'm going to guess a fair amount of people are going to say, really, Jimmy Walker at 7,700? But a lot of people in DFS really do not like pulling the trigger on Jimmy Walker unless it's on the West Coast and he actually shows that he wins a golf tournament or he puts together 2 top 10s in a row. And this is one of the weakest fields Jimmy Walker. Usually when Jimmy gets in the weaker fields, he usually crushes it. And he always plays, I shouldn't say always, he almost always plays significantly better on courses where driving accuracy isn't as important. He's certainly been up and down, this year, which isn't that unusual for him, but you'll definitely notice the correlation I'm talking about when taking a look at him as far as he really does play better on the courses where driving accuracy isn't that important. He's got like miscuts at the Players, the Open Championship, and the U.S. Open, but he's got top 10s at the Farmers and the WGC Cadillac, the Hyundai Tournament Champions, and he's got I think it was like a T20 at Houston, and played pretty well actually at the Masters, all things considered. So, you can kind of see the correlation there when some of the courses where accuracy matters and doesn't matter and what the results provide for him. So, I like Jimmy. 7,300, Jonathan Vegas. I really kind of hated the fact that he shot 60 last week at Barbasol and that he had a T4 just because I thought he would go kind of under the radar since his recent performance hasn't been that great. But nevertheless, I still don't think his ownership's going to be too out of control. And if you follow Vegas, over the last few years, he really has outstanding upside. You see that historically. He's one of the longer hitters, and I think he's certainly got a really good shot at a top 10 for a course like Glen Abbey. So 2 guys for the $6,000 range, and then we'll wrap things up. 6,800, Chad Campbell. He really has good upside and consistency for this price in this field. Very solid form. And then at 6,600, Luke List. Another guy who's a bomber who, while he just generally does better on courses that don't really require great driving accuracy. But if you really take a look at List's stats, actually, if he's hitting the ball well, his stats, whether it's approaches to the green, driving distance, scrambling, putting, all his stats are actually pretty darn good. And so essentially when you get him on a course where he can just bomb driver, like this one, essentially, List is pretty good, usually pretty good. So I think he's got top 20, maybe even top 10 in him this week. So a couple things here just before we wrap up also. Shout out to FantasyLabs. They had Henrik Stenson as their #1 golfer in their model, and it was the #1 golfer actually in the model that I tweaked and created on FantasyLabs when trying to provide some help to making some of the picks last week. So just want to give them a shout out to them, and great job with that. And if you guys have not signed up for FantasyLabs, I highly recommend it. Go to DailyFantasyWinners.com and you will see the link for FantasyLabs on our page and in the offer we provide for them. So I really do recommend going there. And then the A-list, again, by the way, so the A-list, which is the guys I just mentioned, will be on DailyFantasyWinners.com in the PGA forum, along with the B-list as well, what I usually do for the traditional PGA tournaments that aren't majors. And the PGA Championship is next week, and I will also have a strategy video as it pertains to when and when not to fade players, essentially, because there seems to be some different strategies out there of like when you're supposed to fade people and when you shouldn't. And so it seems to be a popular topic in DFS golf, and I'll try and touch on that in a separate video coming up shortly, along with a couple of the PGA Championship videos as well. So thanks again for watching. If you like the stuff we've been doing here at Daily Fantasy Winners, please remember to like and subscribe to our Twitch and YouTube channels. And of course, you can follow me at Juskewycz on Twitter, and then Daily Fantasy Winners on Twitter at DFantasyWinners. All right, good luck, everybody.